Are you at a crossroads in life with unanswered questions? How does your past connect to your present life? October Hallam can help you discover how your past connects to your present and is shaping your future. October is an intuitive, healer, empath, and medium with over 20 years of experience helping people navigate through some of life's greatest challenges. A recent client from Egypt says, October is pure magic. We keep coming back for more and recommended her to our closest friends. If you would like to book a session with October, please contact her at theancientgift222@gmail.com. Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Larry Arnold. First, I have a couple of announcements. Check out our website, forbiddenknowledge.news. It's the home of the Forbidden Knowledge Network. This is where you find some of your favorite podcasts from our community featured. Forbidden Knowledge News is always available on Rokfin, Odyssey, Rumble, and all podcast platforms. Rokfin is where you get our premium content. You also get all the premium content from every creator on Rokfin for only $10 a month. Just go to rokfin.com/FKN+. That's ROKFIN.com/FKN+ to sign up now. Finally, if you would like to help with the donation for the documentary, anything is greatly appreciated so we can get this show literally on the road. You can go to supportfkn.com, or we have a PayPal link right there in the description. Any donation of $5 or more through supportfkn.com, you'll get access to Cory Hughes' secret JFK forum and tons of information that will and won't be going into his new book. Anything is greatly appreciated. Today I want to welcome Larry Arnold. He redirected a background in engineering to explore the unconventional. Recognized internationally for his pioneering Fourian research, he is regarded as the leading authority about spontaneous human combustion. His investigation of SHC spans a quarter century and several continents. He is author of 3 books and has been featured on hundreds of radio shows and many television programs. Larry, welcome. How you doing?
Oh, it's been a frustrating day, as you will know. Your listeners won't know this, but we had trouble connecting via Zoom, and now we're on a landline phone. So let's hope the electronics in the universe between you and us hold together for the rest of the evening.
Well, we're past the worst of it, and we're going to make this happen. This is going to be so interesting. I remember being extremely creeped out as a kid watching documentaries. I think it was in the late 80s or early 90s, and one of the images in there is a possible scene of spontaneous human combustion, which contained just some smoldering feet and a smoldering chair, and that image is still kind of, excuse the pun, burned into my brain today, along with the possibility that a human can just burst into flames without explanation. So I've been looking forward to this. This is your first time on. First, tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to research this phenomenon.
Well, our background is basically in science. Our time at Lafayette College was in mechanical engineering. We left that and worked several years in the electrical engineering trade. And then we had kind of a shift of consciousness and got involved in studying Fortean phenomena, which took us back to our junior high school days. We were always kind of an iconoclast. We had a scientific background, a scientific methodology to most everything that we did. But we developed a more and more in-depth interest in things that mainstream science seemed to be ignoring or poo-pooing or just not investigating at all. So when we left the engineering profession, we remembered something that we had read about in junior high school in a paperback book that had a chapter called Incredible Incinerations, and it talked about one particular case, that of Mary Reeser. And in our college days and subsequent high school days, we would talk to our teachers, our professors about this, and no one had heard about it. No one could tell us anything about it. So when we had that kind of shift in consciousness in the late 60s, early 70s, we decided to go back and look into this subject a little further to see if there was any credibility, any merit to it. And what we discovered in our ensuing investigations, which has now pretty much consumed most of this physical lifespan of ours, is that what history has called spontaneous human combustion is indeed bizarre. It's eerie, frightening, horrific to contemplate. And yet beyond its innate horror is something that, at least for us and hopefully for your listeners this evening as well as for yourself, is that it's a subject that is incredibly, captivatingly fascinating. It's fascinating in terms of its impact on biology, on medicine, on fire science, and other scientific disciplines, as well as on human psychology.
What were some of the first cases that you started looking at whenever you started looking into this?
That's an easy one to answer. The first case that got us introduced to the subject of what history has called spontaneous human combustion, SHC, and what we have preferred to rename either super hyperthermic carbonization or sudden human cremation, is the case that happened to Mary Reeser in St. Petersburg, Florida in 1951. This is the case that we read about in junior high school. And basically, Mrs. Reeser was burned so completely that she became known locally as the Cinder Woman. In July of 1951, on the evening of July 1st, she was spoken to by her son, Dr. Richard Reeser, and left around 9 o'clock that evening in apparently good health, saying she was going to take a tablet or two of Seconal sleeping tablet, have a nice summer's rest in her chair in her apartment in St. Pete, Florida. Everything seemed to be hunky-dory, peachy keen, fine when Dr. Reeser left his mother. And several hours later, the following morning, a Western Union telegram arrived, and the messenger attempted to knock on her door to deliver the telegram, but got no response. He went to the other end of the apartment complex in St. Pete, Florida, and had the landlady, Pansy Carpenter, try to deliver the telegram to Mrs. Reeser. It was going to be a telegram that said she could come back to her home state in Pennsylvania, which is also our home state. When Mrs. Carpenter attempted to open the door to Mrs. Reeser's apartment, she screamed in horror because the handle was hot to the touch. Two painters across the street responded to her verbal alarm, broke down the door, went in, and discovered a scene that was later described as macabre beyond belief. Mrs. Reeser had burned in a quite localized but apparently incredibly intense conflagration that was limited to her body, her chair, and a small table next to the chair. On the evening of July 1st, Mrs. Reeser was about 170, 175 pounds in weight, slightly rotund woman. The morning of July 2nd, she had been reduced to a pile of ash and rubble that weighed about 8 to 10 pounds, and that included the remains of the chair and the end table that was next to the chair in which she immolated. What was left of her body was 1 foot intact inside a satin slipper, a few pieces of calcined vertebrae, some tissue that was thought to be her liver, and a skull that was said by several first responders to have shrunken to the size of a teacup or orange or grapefruit. There was no other significant fire or heat damage in her apartment, and this completely bumfuddled the local authorities in St. Pete at the time.
How many other documented cases really had there been before this one?
Interesting question. Certainly, if one perused the obscure, specialized medical literature as we did over the subsequent decades of investigating this subject, there were several hundred cases that you could find, but they were mostly dated from the 17 and 1800s. And as debunkers and naysayers of spontaneous human combustion are quick to point out, you can't rely on these cases ostensibly because they were old, they were kind of superstition-based, and medical personnel in that era simply were not astute and smart enough to recognize the difference between a normally burned human being and a body that was burned almost completely to powder, as was Mrs. Reeser's. Mrs. Reeser is the first modern case that fits the classic definition of spontaneous human combustion, which is a very localized blistering, burning of the body in the absence of significant surrounding heat and flame damage. And that fits the classic definition of what we call classic spontaneous human combustion. The local officials in the Reeser case at the time were saying things like, this was an accidental death by fire of unknown origin. The fire department, the police department in St. Pete spent God knows how many man-hours trying to figure out how Mrs. Reeser could have burned to the extent she did and under the circumstances in which they documented the fire scene itself.
Now, how hot are you talking when we're talking about the internal flames that would be manifested from this?
That is a significant and very important question to answer. The answer is this. When a structure fire burns to the ground, temperatures rarely exceed 15 to 1700 degrees Fahrenheit. If a body is trapped in a structure fire, you can almost always bring the body out largely intact, take it to a morgue, and autopsy it for scenes of foul play, motor arson, or smoke inhalation, anything like that, to determine the true cause of death. When a cadaver is placed in a crematorium, temperatures get a little hotter. When we began our research back in the 70s, crematoria normally operated at temperatures of 22 to 2400 degrees Fahrenheit for an hour and a half to 2.5 hours. And then the temperature in the retort was lowered to 17 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit for another hour and a half to 2 hours. And what comes out of a crematorium retort is not the proverbial dust and ashes that are given to next of kin, but ashes mingled with large bone fragments. Any competent forensic anthropologist, as, for example, Dr. Krogman, who was involved in the Reeser case, would tell you, you can identify those parts of the bone fragments as being human, indeed, from what sex the bones came from. Those bones are then put in a grinder. Professionals call it a cremulator, in which the bone fragments are ground to powder and put in an urn, which are then given to the next of kin. You don't get that kind of intense destruction normally, unless, according to Dr. Krogman, as he told us in personal interviews and in writing about the subject of Mrs. Reeser in particular, you don't get a body burned to the extent that Mrs. Reeser was found burned unless you have a cadaver and a retort operating at 3,000 degrees for 12 uninterrupted hours. Clearly, conditions like that were not present in Mrs. Reeser's apartment in St. Pete on the morning of July 2, 1951, or the entire structure would have burned to the ground.
Now, approximately how many cases could you say are actually spontaneous human combustion? How many global cases do you estimate that there have been?
We have in our database involving people now in excess of 600 cases that appear to fit the definition of spontaneous human combustion. That's a large number for something that is deemed to be impossible. That does not happen. On the other hand, considering that those cases span several centuries, given the number of people that have been alive and died during several centuries, the odds of this phenomenon happening to any particular person is extraordinarily, extremely small. You stand a better chance of being hit multiple times by a lightning bolt than becoming a victim of classic spontaneous human combustion. That said, there are enough cases, including incredible photographic documentation and interviews that we have conducted with first responders over the decades, that attest to the reality of this phenomenon as fiercely and adamantly as mainstream science still wants to deny the existence of the subject.
Let's get into some of the other prominent cases that you've looked at, starting with one of the most prominent for you?
The most prominent for us, other than Mrs. Reeser, that, as we said, introduced us to this whole phenomenon and set us on a career path change, was the event that happened to Dr. John Irving Bentley, again in our home state of Pennsylvania back in 1966. His event happened on overnight, December 4th through the morning of December 5, 1966. He was a family physician, quite precocious, beloved, the quintessential old-time country family doctor living in Coudersport, Potter County, which is in the north central tier of our home state of Pennsylvania. He had a hip injury several years earlier that required him to move about his two-room apartment consisting of a sitting room, sleeping room, and an adjoining bathroom by use of an aluminum walker. But he was in good spirits. He was, by all accounts of the people that we interviewed who knew him at the time, in pretty good health for a 92-year-old gentleman. Quite precocious, quite astute, loved to argue with people, and sound of mind. But something happened overnight on December 4, December 5, 1966, that belies common sense and refutes everything that is commonly accepted within the fire service firefighting communities. The morning of December 5, 1966, Don Garsnell, a volunteer fireman as well as a gas meter reader for the North Penn Gas Company, began his rounds, and early on that morning, his rounds began with reading the gas meter in the basement of Dr. Bentley's home on North Main Street in Coudersport. Community at that time did not lock the doors. Mr. Garsnell just walked into the hallway that led past Dr. Bentley's appointment en route to the basement to read the gas meter down there. In doing so, he noticed there's a gray, whitish smoke in the hallway and an odd, sweet smell that he couldn't recognize immediately. He proceeded down the basement steps, read the gas meter, and on returning to cross the earthen floor and go back upstairs, his flashlight beam span across a pile of ashes on the floor. He walked over as a volunteer fireman. He was curious, kicked a pile of ash, which he estimated to be about 5 inches in height, 14 inches in diameter, with his work boot. He saw no embers. He wondered where that pile of powder had come from. He looked overhead and saw a hole in the basement ceiling about 2.5 by 3 feet in size, ruined by some cherry embers. He thought to himself, as he told us when we interviewed him at length about this case, that, gee, there must have been a fire overnight in Dr. Bentley's home, but I wonder why we didn't get a fire call to come and put it out, and what possibly could have burned. With that in thought, he went back upstairs, and before leaving Dr. Bentley's house to go to the next house to read its meter, he yelled for Dr. Bentley a morning greeting, but got no response. And as Coudersport residents at that time kind of looked after one another, Mr. Gosnell decided to peer in Dr. Bentley's apartment, make sure Dr. Bentley was okay. Peered into the sitting room and did not see Dr. Bentley sitting in the chair where he normally spent most of his days. Mr. Gosnell walked farther, peered into the bathroom, and forever after wished he had not done that, because what he saw in the bathroom was the other side of the hole that he had moments earlier looked up at from the basement. Now he was looking down at that hole that led to the basement. Atop the hole was Dr. Bentley's aluminum walker, intact, lying against Dr. Bentley's bathtub. And at one end of the hole, tangential to it, was half of a leg, which Mr. Gosnell first thought was a mannequin leg, wondering what the heck would Dr. Bentley be doing with a mannequin's leg. When Mr. Gosnell leaned down to look at the leg closer, he realized it was not a fake leg, not a mannequin's leg, but a human leg, half of a leg. And at that point, Gosnell realized, oh my God, the ashes that I just kicked with my work boot down in the basement were the remains of Dr. Bentley himself. Dr. Bentley had managed to burn himself, less one leg and part of his skull, through his bathroom floor, through the tar-based linoleum flooring that covered it, almost through one oak beam joist below the floor, partially damaging, burning through two other oak beams, and reduced his 180-pound body to literally a few pounds of dry powder in the earthen floor below, aside from half of one leg, his legacy to the world. We were at that fire scene ourselves. By the time we got there, the hole in the floor had been patched over, but nothing else had been changed. The bathtub in Dr. Bentley's bathroom, against which his aluminum walker lay, was painted. It was not enameled, but was covered with enamel paint, not baked porcelain. We could chip that paint off the bathtub. The paint itself, though darkened from soot, was not blistered. There was absolutely no damage by heat or flame to the ceiling of the bathroom directly above the hole through which Dr. Bentley himself immolated. We could touch that ceiling with our outstretched arm. Again, no heat or flame damage to the ceiling. This was, as in the Reeser case, an astonishingly localized, apparently fearsome fire that was relegated and restricted almost wholly to the human itself. That was the fire fatality at the scene. In the Reeser case, Dr. Krogman, a renowned forensic anthropologist at the time, took a personal interest in what happened to Reeser and found the same conditions with the Reeser case that we found in the Bentley case several years later. For the Reeser case, Krogman said he was mystified by the extent of reduction of the body, the apparent localized tremendous heat that would have been necessary to consume a body to the extent that it was burned, the time available in the Reeser case, less than 4.5 hours probably. In the Bentley case, perhaps 11 to 12 hours maximum. There was also, Krogman said in the Reeser case, the absence of noxious odor. When a human body is burned normally, every firefighter to whom we have spoken, every medic who we know who served in Vietnam, tell us that you never forget the unmistakable odor of burned human flesh. Mm. And yet in the Reeser case, there was a slightly sweet odor. In the Bentley case, Don Gosnell told us that he discerned a very sweet odor in the hallway that he likens somewhat to burning fuel oil, quite atypical of a normal fatal fire scene. For Krogman in the Reeser case, there was the mystery of the shrunken skull that was, as we said, described by those first responders as about the size of a teacup or grapefruit. In the Bentley case, the photographs that we have of that scene do not give us a real way to judge the size of Dr. Bentley's head. It was lying on the water pipes below the level of the floor. And none of the first responders whom we interviewed, they were also nonplussed by what they witnessed, that they didn't take any particular heed to the size of the skull. So we can't comment on the shrunken skull possibility in the Bentley case. But as Krogman said, and as every firefighter involved in the Bentley case told us, this was an affront to logic and to common sense. Bodies should not burn so severely, so completely, so thoroughly in such a localized, isolated fire scene. It just did not make any sense as to what they knew in terms of fire science, firefighting, or forensic anthropology. And yet, as Krogman said to us, the Reeser case hinted at similarities to scores of other deaths, which he in time would just dismiss and blame it on a dropped cigarette. Well, again, we've spoken to many, many firefighters over the decades that were researching this phenomenon, all of whom have had, dealings with conventional chair fires, in which the occupant perhaps dropped a cigarette or a pipe. In the Bentley case, it was argued that Dr. Bentley, being a pipe smoker, dropped his pipe on his lap. We'll argue against that in a moment if you would like us to.
Yeah.
But in all these cases, the body can still, even though it may be burned fatally, can be picked up intact, taken to a morgue and autopsied. It's really difficult to autopsy ashes in the Reeser case, and in the Bentley case, even though the death certificate affirms that there was indeed an autopsy performed, as the deputy coroner said to us, John Deck, Larry, how the hell do you autopsy ashes? So one of the problems with investigating this subject is looking at historical documents that belie the truth of the incident. In Dr. Bentley's case, the autopsy says that, or the death certificate says that an autopsy was performed. It was not. It says that the cause of death was asphyxiation. It could not have been because no trachea or lungs were left to be autopsied. And further, it says that the length of duration of the fire that consumed his body almost wholly to powder was about 30 minutes. Well, there's no way to estimate that. It's just the time frame in most of these cases simply isn't known beyond more than perhaps a day or two in length. There are exceptions to that, and we'll be happy to discuss those time frame factors in some other cases with you. Yeah. But what we want to get at here is that with the Reeser case, we have photographs of her leg and the pieces of body that were left lying on a morgue table. In the Bentley case, we have incredible photographs that form the poster for classic spontaneous human combustion. Some of our critics argue that spontaneous human combustion, as we prefer to call it, sudden human cremation, cannot occur because there is no known case in which internal organs of a person are burned more completely than our external body parts. That's a quote from Mark Benecke, a renowned famous forensic anthropologist. The Reeser case belies that, the Bentley case belies that, and scores of other cases that we'll be discussing with you and your listeners this evening belie that claim. There were no lungs, there was no trachea, there was no kidney, no esophagus, no pancreas at either the Reeser fire scene nor the Bentley fire scene. So based on the argument that Mark Benecke makes to dispel sudden human cremation, the fact that those internal organs were burned, were consumed far more completely than were external body parts, in Mrs. Reeser's case, her foot, and in Dr. Bentley's case, his lower leg, proves argumentatively that SHC is indeed a historical, real, bona fide Fortean phenomenon.
Hello, friends. I want to introduce you to my friend, Justin Padini. Justin is a self-proclaimed online court jester, comedian, and artist who uses his gift of humor to speak truth to power. Justin shares countless jokes freely online, and they're definitely not woke jokes. So please be sure to have on your big boy pants when you view Justin's content. He is also a featured speaker on the One Great Work Network and promotes other activists doing the great work. Justin is looking to reach like-minded individuals to promote the message of freedom and grow his network. Follow Justin on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and the One Great Work Network. That's Justin Padini, Pedini. All of his links are right in the description. Wow. Now, you said that there are some cases that would show that there's some sort of time frame involved, or this could occur over a period of time?
Yes, indeed, there are. And the critics of our research really don't like hearing us discuss this. But since we sat down with the fire marshals, the fire chiefs, the first responders in these cases, and got their firsthand testimony at fire scenes to which they responded and found themselves completely bumfuddled, thoroughly mystified, and nonplussed by these fire scenes, we can simply recount them for you as we have done in our book Ablaze. One of those cases involves Helen Conway. Helen Conway was a 49-year-old widow living in Bolingbrook, Illinois, a very wealthy suburb, basically of greater Chicago. On Thanksgiving weekend, 1979, her son, Frank, left her alone for a couple of days while he went on a skiing vacation. She was 51 years of age at the time, a widow, and seemed to be in pretty good health. When her ex-daughter-in-law came by the next afternoon to pick up some stuff at the, did we say this is the Oski case or the Conway case? We don't want to get them confused. We're talking about the Beatrice Oski case at the moment. This is a
Oski
good
case.
This is in Bolingbrook, Illinois, 1979 Thanksgiving weekend. The ex-daughter-in-law went to get some items from that home, and when she entered the home, the suburban home, she noticed things were dark, had an unusual smell, and looking down into the lower level of the home, this was a split-level suburban unit, she saw what she thought was a chair fire, and immediately called the fire department and the police. Police arrived first, the fire department soon thereafter, and everybody initially thought, yep, this is a localized chair fire. no flames to put out. Until they got closer to the chair and realized that in the chair were the remains of a human body. Turns out it was Beatrice Oski. And what was left of Beatrice was not a whole lot. Her lower legs were propped up against the front of the chair. Her left arm had been burned to the bone. Some of her jewelry was still dangling from her forearm. She had been pushed back into the chair as if the back of the chair had broken down. The body was very badly burned, but not quite as completely as had Mrs. Reeser's body nor Dr. Bentley's body. Still, this was an incredibly localized fire, suggestive of a very high heat source, and yet surrounding materials were largely intact. And by surrounding materials being largely intact, we are not exaggerating. She had a knitted afghan that was under her feet, looked absolutely pristine, not harmed by fire or smoke in any fashion. Inches away from the chair on which she so fiercely burned was a sofa that had a plastic slip cover on it, showed almost no heat distension from heat, no deformation from heat. At her feet also was a vinyl-covered hassock that was intact. As the fire marshal, Vince Calcagno, and his fire chief, Mr. Drugan, told us, there was not enough fuel load in the chair to cause this amount of damage to her body. Chief Drugan told us that he likened her incineration to a tanker fire that burned like a bitch. As we said, it devoured her left arm. Some of her fingers were missing. And the police department wanted to write this off as a smoking mishap incident. Chief Calcagno at the time refused to accept that. He said, that doesn't make any sense. There's not enough fuel loading here to cause this kind of destruction to the body. In terms of the time element, her watch was still intact, and it showed a time of about 12:15. There was another clock elsewhere in the house that showed a time of about 12:15 to 12:20. The fire officials at the time determined that since the ex-daughter-in-law had come into the home at about 12:30 when the fire car was called in, the clocks had to have stopped at 12:15, 12:20 a.m., 12 hours earlier. Perhaps, but as we pointed out to them, based on our experience with another case that we'll talk to you about later, that also involves a lockdown time frame, just as likely and probably much more likely, those clocks stopped not at 12:15, 12:20 a.m., but 12:15 to 12:20 p.m., literally 10 to 15 minutes before the ex-daughter-in-law arrived at the house, and could have been eyewitness to this phenomenon. The smoke detector, which was given to us for analysis after we were at the fire scene, the smoke detector did not activate during the fire, but we tested it afterwards and exposing it to a bit of heat, to a bit of smoke, and it functioned properly. So there's another mystery. Why didn't a smoke detector in a house that had such an apparent fearsome combustion happening within it set off the smoke detector?
Interesting.
Vince Calcagno, the fire marshal, was so perplexed by this that he demanded that an autopsy be done because in this case there were enough body parts remaining that they could be autopsied. And one of the big results of that autopsy, well, there are two. One, they could find no accelerant. There was no foul play involved in this incident. Mrs. Oski was not a victim of a suicide. She was not a victim of arson murder. No accelerant, no high temperature accelerant was found at the scene. No gasoline, no kerosene, nothing like that. The second mystery that was discovered when the autopsy was conducted was that there was no blood. Not one drop of blood, Calcagno told us, was discovered within her remains. The irony of this is, as badly burned as she was, Mrs. Oski's remaining body parts were recremated and buried. So here's one case where we have a pretty good hold on a time frame, probably 10 to 15 minutes at which it transpired. We do know that on the sofa, on the undistended, undamaged plastic slipcover, was a copy of the Chicago Tribune, we believe for that morning, which meant that Mrs. Oski had gone outside to pick up the newspaper that morning before her body was burned. So that's another indicator that this was a very short-lived fire that consumed her body.
That's incredible.
As Fire Chief Dugan told us, quote unquote, it baffles the hell out of me. And both he and his fire marshal, Calcagno, were willing to consider SHC as the cause of her death, particularly after we showed them from our collection other photographs and told them about other cases that were remarkably similar to what happened to Beatrice Oski.
Wow.
Speaking about the lack of noxious odor at these remarkable fire scenes in the Oski case, her son Frank told us that when he got back to the house, and this was confirmed by the first responders as well, the interior of the house smelled like hickory incense. Now that is a description about as far removed from the normal noxious odor of burned human flesh as one can get.
Yeah. That is interesting. Now, are there any other cases that could show possible time frames before we move on from this?
Absolutely. The case that we really have been able to lock down in terms of a time frame, and this is so important because debunkers and the arguments that they raise against spontaneous human combustion, against sudden human cremation, is that these fires are slow, smoldering, low heat combustions taking many, many hours, 5 hours to 12 hours in duration, producing minimal heat so we don't get surrounding fire damage or heat damage to combustibles like stacks of newspapers or bed linens or things like that. We actually have a couple cases where bodies have been very severely burned inside the garments themselves are undamaged. But coming back to the time frame, the case that really locks this issue down for us and puts the lie to the debunkers' claims that these are low heats, long smoldering fires happened to a lady named Helen A. Conway, also a Pennsylvania resident. She was a widow, a businesswoman, who on November 8th, 1964, asked her granddaughter to fetch her a pack of cigarettes. She was sitting in her second floor sitting room in Upper Darby Township, which is southeastern Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. How we discovered this case is remarkable in itself. We were given special access as a non-firefighter to attend an advanced arson course at the Pennsylvania Fire Academy. And near the end of that course, the fire instructor, Buzz Trebold, said he had just received a photograph that some people might characterize as this thing called spontaneous human combustion. Oh, horrors. And as he described a lady that was burned in a chair, a very localized fire. We thought, oh, this must be the Reeser case. Well, when the photograph was passed around and finally ended up in our hands, we realized that this case, the photograph of it, in no way was the Mary Reeser case. This was a case that we knew nothing about, but none of the cases that at that time we had amassed in our database. So you can easily imagine us rushing up to Buzz Trebold after the rest of the class members left with the questions, who, where, what, how. And all he could tell us was that this was a woman who had burned somewhere in southeastern Pennsylvania. He had no name, no date, only that information. Well, southeastern Pennsylvania, as we said, is Philadelphia. That's like 500 or 5 million people. With no date and no name, it would seem to be almost impossible to discover who this victim is. Through some serendipitous coincidences, if you will, and some dogged detective work, it took us 9 months, but we discovered that this photograph depicted the fire scene death of Helen Conway. She left behind, as you described earlier when you were kindly introduced us to the subject at the top of the program, she left behind 2 legs propped up against the front of her sitting chair, burned off pretty much just above the kneecaps. The heat of the fire was severe. Beyond that point, the subcutaneous tissue in her thighs had been lacerated, had split open. Her left arm was burned to the ulna, right to the bone. One of the photographs that Bob Meslin, at that time a volunteer firefighter and a photographer, later to become fire marshal for Upper Darby Township. His photographs show a charm bracelet dangling from the bone of her left wrist. Her upper torso is incinerated so that it appears that the internal organs are kind of fused together. And she, again, was pushed back as if by force into the back of the chair so that one of the photographs shows the inverted V of her jaw being exposed above her torso. And there's still a wisp of smoke coming from her upper torso as well as from the arm of of the chair in which she incinerated. The granddaughter immediately called the fire department. They arrived within a few minutes to find a fire that basically they did not have to put out. The fire chief, Paul Haggerty, told Meslin to leave the scene, get a camera, and come back and start taking photographs. Blessedly, he did. These are an amazing 12 photographs that he took and gave to us. They clearly prove that sudden human cremation fires do happen. The photographs, as some claimed to be hoaxes, are not hoaxed. They are not photoshopped. These are real photographic documentations of a bona fide fire phenomenon that is yet to be adequately explained. As Haggerty told us, it looked like she had been hit by the blast of the afterburner of a jet engine. That's how severe the destruction to her body was. We come now to the time element. In sitting down with Bob Meslin and the Assistant Fire Marshal, Harry Lott, as well as Fire Chief Haggerty, all of those first responders assured us that after they completed their investigation of this fire scene, the fire had to occur in less than 30 minutes. Bob Meslin put the time frame down in writing to us in no more than 21 minutes. That is astounding. That is astonishing. That should be impossible. But we rely on their expertise, on their firsthand experience to determine a time frame of about 21 minutes from the time that Mrs. Conway was known to be alive until the fire department swept out the scene. However, it's less than 21 minutes for this reason. When Bob Meslin wrote to us that it was a 21-minute interval, that included the time from when the alarm was first called in until he completed taking a dozen photographs and smoke was had been ejected from the room itself. Sitting down with him at his kitchen table in Upper Darby Township and going over the details of this incident, you have to subtract from that 1 minute the time it took him to leave the fire scene, go home, get his camera, have the smoke ejected by other firefighters at the fire scene, and then for him to take a dozen photographs. When you do the math, as we did with him, you come down to not 21-minute interval, but 6 minutes maximum. 360 seconds is the time allowable for Mrs. Conway to have been burned so completely that it just completely baffled every first responder and, frankly, every fire official to whom we've shown these photographs since then and explained to them the details. The challenge is explaining to the firefighters exactly what happened at the Conway fire scene. Mm-hmm. Their first reaction is, oh, she dropped a cigarette on her lap. Well, no, you will not get this kind of destruction in a 6-minute time frame from a dropped cigarette. It takes normally hours for a dropped cigarette to smolder and become hot enough to start a chair fire that would then, partially burn the person sitting in that chair.
Right. Now, what is the... Well, go ahead.
When we left our meeting with Fire Marshal Meslin, we went a few miles east to Philadelphia, downtown Philadelphia, to the city fire department there, because we had some other cases in the greater Philadelphia area that we wanted to document. And we introduced ourselves to one of the top fire inspectors in the city that morning and explained why we were there and could we see the files on. We gave the names and the dates and the locations because this was for research purposes. And he very smugly told us that, well, Larry, Mr. Arnold, we don't have any of those files to show you. We thought, well, did you move them to a different location? We'll go there. Did they get destroyed? Whatever. He said, no, we don't have any files to show you in any of the cases that you're asking about because those fires, as you've described them, cannot happen. Just cannot happen. Therefore, obviously, we can't have files on something that didn't happen. Well, if you'll be patient with us, let us show you some photographs. And we put on his desk the photographs of Mrs. Reeser explained the situation. We put on his desk the photographs of Dr. Bentley's fire scene and explained the situation. And then we put on his desk the photographs of Helen Conway, from whom we had just come from discussing the case with Bob Meslin. So those facts were really fresh in our memory. We gave him all the data, all the evidence that we could, succinctly give to him. And then we put this question to him. You, sir, are the expert. You're a firefighter in one of the largest cities in America. From your professional standpoint and expertise, help us understand how these localized, almost wholly incinerated human incinerations can occur. If you were called out to one of these fire scenes, what would you do? What would your response be? And we shall never forget his answer. It was, direct quote, I'd go out, I'd get drunk, and I'd forget about it.
Oh, wow.
At which point he told us to clean up our documents, put everything back in our folder, in our briefcase, and he escorted us out to the sidewalk. Oh. He just could not cope with looking at fire scenes and knowing the circumstances and the history of fire scenes that his decades of fire service had trained him to consider to be impossibilities. And that's been one of the challenges of our research. These cases are rare. If they happened every day, there are thousands of people who die every year in America, unfortunately, from smoking mishaps. If they all burned to the extent that Mrs. Reeser and Mrs. Conway and Dr. Bentley did, this wouldn't be a mystery. It wouldn't be able to be denied, as did that fire inspector in Philadelphia.
Are all these being deemed basically smoking-related deaths, or just accidents related to fire accidents?
Yeah, very, very astute observation and comment. The answer is basically yes. As we said in Dr. Bentley's death certificate, he died by asphyxiation. Well, that's just absolutely preposterous, because in order to determine medically asphyxiation, you need a trachea or lungs or an esophagus. None of those existed. As several of the fire instructors that have taught us to better understand how fire is supposed to behave have told us over the decades, every fire is unique. Every fire has its own oddball characteristics, and you should always, always in the fire service profession, keep an open mind. And when it comes to fire scenes like we've been describing so far, the most important thing above all, above decades of personal experience, above decades of academic training and education, is the necessity, the need to keep an open mind. Mm-hmm. Because these fires belie everything that most firefighters have been taught to encounter, have been taught to understand, have been taught to explain. When we went down to the National Fire Academy in Emmitsburg, Maryland, wrapping up our research before our book Ablaze was published, we had the opportunity to meet with the three senior fire instructors on duty that day. One of them looked at the photographs as we attempted to hand them to him and said, "Oh, I've heard about this, but frankly, I'm not interested," and he walked away. The second gentleman we encountered in the hallway actually spun on his heels and ran down the hallway away from us. He clearly didn't want to look at the evidence. That scene happened to catch the attention of what turned out to be the third senior instructor that day. He looked at the photographs. He said, "Oh my God, come to my office, tell me everything you know, because, quote unquote, we don't have a clue." So 1 out of 3 is good, but it would have been so much nicer if we had 3 out of 3 people with an open mind, willing to look at the evidence, confront facts and situations that they were trained to deem impossibilities, and yet be open enough to consider that perhaps their training isn't complete, perhaps their knowledge is insufficient. Maybe we can learn something here. And that's been the thrust of our research for, God, now over 4 decades. Right on. Traveling around the world to amass the quantitative data, the photographic evidence, and testimonies from first responders that do attest to these remarkably rare, but scientifically absolutely fascinating cases of human incineration.
Yes, 100%. It is definitely fascinating. They have a couple of other cases here that I was looking at that I don't think we've covered yet. Have you looked
Okay.
have you looked into the Henry Thomas case from South Wales?
We indeed have. In fact, we were at that fire scene, obviously after it happened, but we're at the fire scene. That was a case that has been very well documented by John Hamer, who's done a remarkably commendable job of pointing out the insidious, insipid explainaways that have been offered in the Henry Thomas case. Again, attributed to, dropped cigarette, or, a smoking mishap. He fell on the hearth and ignited his body. As John Hamer astutely pointed out, the burned meat that was on the fireplace hearth in Mr. Thomas's home was not human flesh, but steak, basically steak, bovine tissue that probably he used the fireplace to cook some meals on. Again, incredibly localized fire scene, lacking significant fire damage to easily combustible materials around the body. One thing that stands out with the Henry Thomas case in 1980, January of that year, is that it occurred in a very small village called Ibervale. We had no idea when we first heard about the case where Ibervale was, other than it's somewhere in Wales. This happened, as we said, in 1980. 5 years earlier, in 1975, we plotted the cases that we have of fire phenomena, both of people and of property, but mostly people, that have occurred in the United Kingdom. And the reason we did that is because we have more cases per capita of fire phenomena, pyro phenomena in the UK than anywhere else in the world. So we had a fairly good database to work with. We thought we might be able to find some patterns to these fires if we would plot them on a map. We did so. And what we discovered was that about 83% of the unusual Fortean type fires that we had in our database at that time in 1975 could be largely connected by straight alignments crisscrossing the countryside of the United Kingdom, linking 3, 4, 5, and in one remarkable alignment that roughly parallels the east coast of the United Kingdom from England up into Scotland, perhaps linking as many as a dozen cases of mysterious fires. Now, the statistical odds of that are incredibly significant and portend that something must be afoot or underfoot in order that perhaps a dozen cases of SHC-type events, rare to begin with, can be linked by an alignment. When we heard about the Henry Thomas case in 1980, the first thing we did was pull out our map of the fire lanes, as we call them, these alignments of fire that we plotted in 1975 to see if any of these fire alignments went through Wales. A few of them did. And lo and behold, one of them went right through Ibervale. So that we found particularly fascinating, and it lended further support to the theory that some of these fires can be explained by what we call the cartography of combustion, that where you are, but at the wrong time, can become inflammatorily, incendiarily hazardous to one's health or property.
Really? Well, let's talk about some of these other theories as to what could possibly have caused this. Now, there's no known human chemicals in the human body that could be somehow combined through like injury or something to cause any type of phenomenon like this, right?
To our knowledge, that is correct. It's been suggested that, well, there's a researcher in England, Professor Brian Ford, who has posited, and we give him a great deal of pat on the back for suggesting this theory. And his theory is that the body can produce a prodigious amount of acetone. Some people have acetone in the body naturally, and as you probably know, acetone basically paint thinner or nail polish remover is highly combustible. And Mr. Ford's theory is that there is some biological process that causes the body to produce a prodigious quantity of acetone, And once that happens, if you have an external spark, a lit cigarette or a dropped match, then that will ignite the acetone in the victim and cause a furiously hot, localized, intense fire. The problem with the theory is this. For Mr. Ford's experiment to work, he needs a high percentage of acetone, like 75 to 80% acetone. If a person had that level of acetone in his or her body, you would die from acetone poisoning. You would not need a fire to do that. In lesser percentages that would be reasonable, say 7 to 8% acetone in the burned tissue sample, Mr. Ford cannot sustain a lingering combustion. So while it's an imaginative theory that he proposes chemically, the experimental work to support the theory just doesn't hold up. As we indicated earlier, the debunkers, the skeptics, the naysayers of SponCom, when it pertains to humans, always inevitably will invoke the human wick theory. And this was tested many, many times by people in the forensic biology field, by ourselves, and as early as 1850 by noted German chemist von Liebig. At that time, it was believed that alcohol was always present at these localized human incinerations that history called spontaneous human combustion, and that alcohol-sodded tissue ignited externally would cause the body to immolate to powder. Well, von Liebig conducted an experiment to prove that and failed. His experiment could not burn the tissue to powder, and therefore he concluded that SHC ergo cannot happen. And his conclusion has been the foundation for all future considerations of these anomalous localized human infernos ever since, until our research has put a lie to that. But again and again, on almost every television program you see on the subject, you see somebody, probably in a white lab coat, saying, "Oh, this person dropped a cigarette on himself. Oh, this person dropped his pipe on his lap. We have an external ignition source, and ergo, we have a long, slow temperature, prolonged, smoldering combustion. No mystery here. Nothing to marvel about, nothing to puzzle. Anybody who believes otherwise is mystery mongering," which has been a term labeled against us by one of our nemesis, if you will.
Yeah.
The problem is we've conducted the same experiments that von Liebig did, and we can't get the tissue to burn. In fact, we did one of those experiments for the BBC in 1999 when they indeed were discussing the Conway case. And we had a ham shank with a bone in it that we had marinated in a mix of vodka, brandy, and whiskey for a year. We took it out of the marinade, wrapped a flannel shirt around it, laid it on a piece of old, brittle, tar-based linoleum flooring, just as we found in Dr. Bentley's bathroom in 1966, and put a match to it. This was done outside with infinite amount of oxygen available and indeed in a breeze. Ideal conditions for this human sample, this ham shank with its bone, to incinerate to powder, if the wick theory worked. It didn't. The fire self-extinguished after several minutes, and we were left with a ham shank that was still 99% intact. We've done a similar experiment for the Science Channel in 2013. We did that experiment in a burn chamber at a local college here. Got the same result. You don't get human tissue to burn to this extent with the wick theory. It just doesn't work. Even in talking, the wick theory basically posits that an external ignition source lights the fat in the body. That fat begins to burns into subcutaneous tissue, more fat, and basically the body acts like an inside-out inverted candle, where the clothing is the wick and the fat of the body becomes the tallow of the candle. Every experiment that we've done, and we've done several, and every experiment that we know that has been done by von Liebig and others and has been televised fails to do this. We actually have video evidence that one of our main naysayers of the phenomenon, John DeHaan, had attempted to demonstrate how the wick effect works on television in a controlled burn chamber experiment. he actually ended up lying about the event, because at the end of the experiment, he claims, looking at a localized fire that is no longer burning on a futon, that he's proven that SHC doesn't happen, that all these so-called mysterious fires can be explained by the wick effect. What he did was wrap a fistful of candles in some fabric, lay it on a futon, and ignite it. Comes back into the burn chamber and says, look, the fire is put out, it's localized, it's self-extinguished, the human wick theory works. That, to be blunt, is a lie, because we have the video proof that actually what did transpire in that burn chamber was that the fire was raging out of control, was within seconds of going flashover and burning the entire chamber down. Fire suppression equipment had to be brought in to extinguish the raging inferno. After that was done, Mr. DeHaan goes back into the burn chamber. Obviously, the fire is now out, points to this burn area in the chair and says, look, localized fire, self-extinguished. That is not what happened. If one has to lie about the failure of one's experiment to prove a theory, that experiment, as well as the experimenter himself, has no credibility, should have no credibility, has lost all credence.
Yeah, I agree, and that's a whole nother show to get into what science has become lately. That's a sad state. But you mentioned that this could be related to specific alignments. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. We devote 2 chapters in our book to the subject that we call cartography of combustion, where fires that are so strange, so bizarre, that they should not even be happening do occur, and when plotted, fall upon these straight alignments. As we said, following one of those alignments led us to the place where, in Iberville, Wales, in 1980, Henry Thomas incinerated himself in a classic SHC-type fire scene. We have a confluence of unusual fires that occurred in the Lincolnshire area up in northeastern England. In one of our research journeys there, we went to Lincolnshire to document as best as we could strange fires that occurred there in 1904, 1905, and again in 1938. Then we met with the fire brigade commander for Lincolnshire, Mr. Shenton, sat down in his office, introduced ourselves, explained why we had come all the way from America to sit down with him. What had brought us to Lincolnshire which was this bevy of localized, unusual fires. He did not know about those because they had occurred prior to his coming into the fire service. But we thought maybe he might know of a more recent case, if not in Lincolnshire, maybe somewhere else, because firefighters, when they go to arson conventions and firefighting schools, they talk among themselves, and maybe by hearsay they would have heard about one of these strange, almost wholly immolated human combustion cases that he could tell us about. Mr. Shenton's first response to us was, well, Larry, nice to meet you. Happy to have you here and talk about this. But nope, nothing like that comes to mind immediately. But then he got really quiet. He pushed himself away from his desk, and sitting there, we could like sense that something was going on in the brain cells of his memory, and he was trying to recall something. He pulled himself back up to his desk, turned to us, and said, well, a couple years ago, I had kind of forgotten about this, but we did have this fire call, and it was kind of like really strange. And that led us to a very fascinating discussion with him in which he recalled, and we document this case in our book of Blaze for the first time, the case of the hermit in Kirkley on Bain. This elderly gentleman lived alone in what was a veritable fire trap. It was a highly combustible tinderbox of an environment. It had oil-coated paper as window glass. He was a pack rat. He surrounded himself in this small structure in which he lived with stacks of newspapers, books, fabric, boxes, just a tinderbox of an environment. Well, for a couple of days, his neighbors had not seen the old hermit, so they got concerned. They called the authorities. They came out and initially could not find him. The neighbors insisted that he had to be somewhere in this tinderbox of a house because they had not seen him come outside. Firefighters went back in. And as they were walking again through the aisles in his home between stacks of newspaper, they noticed that there was remnants of a meal on the hermit's table. And finally, they realized that they were walking through a line of ashes on the floor between these stacks of newspaper. And in among the ashes that they had been walking through, they now discovered were 2 feet with stockings, parts of his upper torso, but just above the shoulder blades, and his head. That was it. From the center of his torso down to his feet was powder that they had been walking through. Half the body was in good condition, and as Shenton told us, the other half, there was nothing. His arms were ash, his legs were ash, his torso was ash. Based on what Shenton told us, there could not have been any internal organs intact. So once again, going back to Mark Benecke's statement that internal organs must always exist, less burned than our outer body parts. Once again, the hermit and Kirkley on Bain belies that assertion. This happened in the fall of 1992. The hermit was thought to be about 79 years old at the time, and it had to have happened in a fairly short period of time. As Shenton told us, it takes a terrific amount of heat to incinerate bone, leg bone, rib cage, everything like that. And yet, in this tinderbox environment, the fire that so consumed the hermit had failed to ignite stacks of newspaper, had failed to ignite the oil-soaked window glass, quote unquote, that was in the home. It just made no sense. And as you mentioned earlier, Chris, in this case, again, as happens in so many of these bizarre fires, the official verdict was accidental death. Well, yeah, accidental death in terms that there was no foul play involved, but accidental death covers up a whole host of facts that otherwise are lost to history if we had not pursued this case and sat down with the fire brigade commander in Lincolnshire that afternoon. So for Wes, that was an amazingly successful interview. As Shed finally confessed to us, he said, we thinking about this case and how localized the fire was, how intense it was to most of the hermit's body, I can see what your problem is. And at least he was open-minded enough to recognize that really there is something bizarre here. But you have to be open-minded enough initially to recognize what is literally sometimes facing your very eyesight.
Right. Now, I'd love to close with your theories, if any, of what could possibly be happening. There's many that believe that this is something of a spiritual nature, and I'd love to hear if you have any theories about this.
Oh, that's a wonderful place to begin theorizing how this happens. And in fact, that is how we conclude our book Ablaze, with the spiritual aspect of this phenomenon. Before we get to that, we've looked at quantum physics. We've postulated a theory based on applying quantum mechanics to the amount of energy that is involved to incinerate a body. It's about 34 million calories. And that amount of energy liberated or released in a very, very short period of time has some very intriguing implications for quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and subatomic particle physics. We have looked at Kundalini, which is an energy that we believe is a quasi-electric-like energy that every living body has, at least every human living body possesses. Eastern metaphysicians and practitioners and philosophers deal regularly with the concept of Kundalini. This is a quasi-electrical energy that moves up and down the spinal column, can be apparently quite powerful, and it's been our privilege to speak at length with Gopi Krishna, a proponent of Kundalini as an energy that can not only heighten one's conscious awareness, but can do strange things physically and physiologically to one's body. Gopi Krishna had an experience he told us and wrote about, but told us personally that the Kundalini moving through his body had become out of balance. He had the conscious awareness to go within his physical form and rebalance that Kundalini energy. He said, had he not had that ability, he would have become a case for our research to document, because the heat was that intense within his body from this electric-like Kundalini energy. We devoted a full chapter in our book to Kundalini phenomena as it relates to thermal phenomena. It's quite fascinating.
Yes.
But that brings us to the spiritual aspect that you raise quite provocatively. And we conclude our book, Ablaze, by thinking that some of these individuals are on a karmic path that affords them one last physical incarnation on Earth to burn out a few pieces of karma and then move into a higher spiritual plane. And they can do this consciously or perhaps at sometimes unconsciously, but the result is the same. They liberate themselves, the soul, the spirit liberates from the physical body one last time in a burst of radiant-like energy that has a very minimal heat component to it, but can dehydrate the body, dissociate the water molecule, break it into hydrogen, oxygen, and ions. And in that process, we end up with a pile of desiccated powder, Mrs. Reeser, Dr. Bentley, Helen Conway, for firefighters to marvel about, but the person's energy that was animating that physical form is now liberated and freed to a higher plane of consciousness, a higher level of evolution.
Right.
It's a transformative aspect of this phenomenon that raises some very significant and intriguing prospects. Not something you can take to a laboratory, not something you can put under an experiment and test, but philosophically, metaphysically, it raises some very interesting aspects to this phenomena that for many people is so frightening and horrific.
Yes. And there's so many aspects of this. I mean, the paranormal in general, whenever you try and get science involved, it doesn't seem like it's in any of their interest to really get to the bottom or truth, because it would probably harm their bottom line, and they'd probably lose a little money and a little power just from the realization that this stuff is exists, and some of these spiritual truths are out there. So it's probably a big threat to them to even look into this. What do you think that this would ever change for modern science to even consider this?
You've made a very, very astute observation, Chris, and we absolutely concur with it. That has been our experience as well. With rare exceptions, the officials, the mainstream, the orthodoxy in fire science just don't want to contend with the evidence that we have amassed and presented ablaze. That's to their chagrin.
Yeah.
As a scientist and an investigator, we believe that you're only as good as the questions you ask and the possibilities that you're willing to consider. If what you're willing to consider has to fall outside the box of the knowledge that you've been trained to understand and accept, so what? That gives you the opportunity to learn something new. We remember talking to Arthur Clarke about this. He said there were some cases that defy explanation, specifically about SHC, and that left him with a very creepy and unscientific feeling. If there's anything more to SHC, he said, I simply don't want to know. And that's perfectly fine for Arthur C. Clarke, and it's perfectly fine for mainstream fire science and all the naysayers and debunkers who've challenged us.
Mm-hmm.
But don't impose that on everybody. Allow those of us who have more pronounced curiosity, if you will, who find challenges and mysteries to explore and to unravel, because that's how understanding progresses. That's how science progresses, or should progress. Find something hidden, go for it. This universe of ours is full of magical things, as you well know, patiently waiting for our wits to grow sharper.
Yeah. And some of these mysteries, if we knew, would give the people power and take it away from those that hold power currently. So, they wouldn't want that to happen, of course.
Of course.
Well, Larry, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on. I'd definitely love to talk with you again in the future. Before you head out, let the audience know where they can find out more about you and find your books.
Thanks for the opportunity. The website is parascience, PARA Science.com. you can reach us that way. It's not the greatest website, but it'll get any listener who wants to know more in touch with us. Email us, and we'll be happy to share our thoughts, ideas, research with you. The book is Ablaze: The Mysterious Fires of Spontaneous Human Combustion. It looks like a Stephen King novel, but it's nonfiction. At least our critics would argue with that, but hey, what the heck?
Right.
We stand by our research. It is available, obviously, at Amazon, or email us again through the website, and we will happily send a copy autographed and inscribed personally to whoever would want it. It contains hundreds of cases. Many of them have never before been put to the public. Through archival research, we discovered cases that were literally lost to medical history until we found them buried in obscure medical textbooks. It contains chapters devoted to specialized cases that we discovered and documented thoroughly, including cases of survivors of partial spontaneous human combustion. Maybe we can get into that with you, Chris, in a future program.
Sure,
they do exist as well.
That's amazing. That's incredible. Yeah, I'd definitely love to get into this even deeper with you, Larry. That was great. Until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We'll talk again tomorrow. We'll see y'all all then.